Three officers pulled over a young woman riding a motorcycle on a quiet suburban street. There were no raised voices, no struggle. Just a girl in scuffed sneakers and a dusty shirt who had been on her way to see someone she loved. She didn't protest, didn't fight, only stood still as they placed cold cuffs around her wrists. But within moments, the situation began to shift. Not through violence or loud arguments, but because of a single, small object she drew from her pocket. She never had to raise her voice. What she carried spoke volumes. Have you ever been dismissed without a chance to explain? Treated like you didn't belong just for being in the wrong place? Maybe this story will stir something familiar. The late afternoon sun stretched long beams across Millfield Avenue as Brooklyn Hayes guided her aging motorcycle along the polished street lined with towering mansions and trimmed hedges. At 23, she hardly stood out. Worn jeans with holes at the knees, a faded gray tee, blonde hair tied back loosely. On her wrist, a silver bracelet shimmered faintly, and her fingers rested over something hidden in her shirt pocket. A slim metal card she didn't dare lose. She was en route to Walter Reed Hospital to see her grandfather, taking this upscale neighborhood's road only because it was the fastest. As she passed the iron gates of the opulent Blackwood estate, a burst of garish yellow caught her eye. A Lamborghini parked in the circular drive. Gathered around it were a few young men in tailored suits, laughing and admiring the car. Among them stood Bryce Blackwood, 25, tall, immaculately dressed in an Armani suit, his polished shoes reflecting the sun. He was the kind of man used to control, to status, to dominance. As Brooklyn rode by, his lips curled into a sneer. Something about her plainness, her presence, offended him. And in a moment that felt like sport to him, he pulled out his phone and made a call laced with false panic. "There's a thief on a stolen motorcycle heading down Millfield Avenue," he said smoothly. "She was scoping my property. She's dangerous. Please hurry." Before long, sirens pierced the air. 3 police cruisers cornered Brooklyn's motorcycle, boxing her in with blaring lights and screeching tires. Officer Thompson, a seasoned policeman of 15 years, stepped out first. His colleagues joined him, spreading out as they approached her cautiously. Her motorcycle came to a silent stop at the center of the road, its tires leaving faint smudges behind. "Step away from the vehicle," Thompson instructed firmly. "Keep your hands visible. We received a report that you're riding a stolen bike." Brooklyn's chest tightened. All around her, people had started to gather, neighbors, passers-by, phones raised, already recording. But she stayed composed, her voice even though her pulse was racing. "There's been a mistake," she said. "This motorcycle is mine. I've had it since college. I can show you the documents." The golden light of sunset made the scene look surreal. Her simple clothes, her weathered bike, her calm presence, surrounded by polished cars and manicured perfection. From across the street, Bryce strutted toward the officers with a look of smug satisfaction. "That's her," he announced confidently. "I saw her breaking into a motorcycle at Central Park earlier today. There are cameras that can back that up." He spoke with the ease of someone used to being believed. And then, as if on cue, a voice chimed in from a nearby garden. Mrs. Langford, a longtime resident of the exclusive neighborhood, stood behind her iron gate and joined the accusations. "I've seen that girl hanging around before," she said loudly. "She doesn't belong here, probably casing the houses." Officer Thompson felt the tug of politics, the kind that came with neighborhoods like Millfield Heights, places where wealth didn't just buy homes, but influence. Places where families like the Blackwoods were known donors to police events and campaigns. He knew from experience that ignoring their claims could stir backlash. Still, there was something about Brooklyn's silence. Her posture, her lack of panic. It didn't match what they'd been told. And then she reached slowly into her pocket, not in defiance but with intention, and pulled out the metal card she had guarded so carefully. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't fake ID. It was her Department of Veterans Affairs medical card. Her name was etched next to the words U.S. Army Medical Technician. A badge of service, sacrifice, and duty. Brooklyn didn't say a word. She didn't have to. "Ownership for this motorcycle?" The officer's voice was calm, though a trace of doubt crept in. Brooklyn gave a slow nod, deliberately reaching into her back pocket, every motion careful and visible. "Of course, officer. I have my license and registration right here." Before she could retrieve the documents fully, Bryce cut in, stepping forward with unwarranted confidence. His voice grew louder, aiming to rally the onlookers. "Don't let her delay, officers. People like her always have some sob story or forged paperwork ready. I saw her take that bike myself." Murmurs rippled through the small crowd that had begun to form. Many nodded in agreement, swayed by Bryce's expensive clothes and unshakable tone. Brooklyn calmly pulled out her ID, but Officer Thompson's eyes were already drawn to something else, a quiet strength in her composure. Despite the shameful scene, she carried herself with unshaken dignity. A simple silver bracelet on her wrist gleamed subtly, clearly more than just jewelry to her. As she reached out to hand over her license, Bryce interrupted again with a sneer. "What's next? She'll tell you that cheap bracelet is a family treasure? Come on, she's just making it up as she goes. People like her will say anything to dodge trouble." That remark turned the crowd's attention to the bracelet, and Brooklyn instinctively pulled her arm closer, shielding the object that clearly held deep meaning. Then something changed. As Officer Thompson reached for his cuffs, Brooklyn quietly retrieved a small metal card from her shirt pocket. Something official-looking, sharp-edged and gleaming. She held it up with a steady hand, barely trembling despite the weight of the moment. The officer squinted at the card, noting its official format, though it wasn't one he immediately recognized. Bryce was undeterred. "Oh, please," he barked. "A fake military ID now? That's a federal crime. She's just digging her hole deeper with these ridiculous lies." Mrs. Langford stepped closer, her designer handbag pressed tight against her side. "I've lived here 30 years, she declared with certainty. "And I know a scam when I see one. Officer, don't fall for this nonsense." Again, heads nodded. The contrast between Brooklyn's modest appearance and the upscale neighborhood made it easy for them to assume guilt. Thompson hesitated. The texture and weight of the card in Brooklyn's hand felt genuine. He'd handled military IDs before, but the political pressure of dismissing someone like Bryce, whose family donated generously to the precinct, loomed large. "Ma'am," he finally said, reaching for his radio, "I'll need to verify this through official channels. Until then, please remain calm and cooperative." Brooklyn nodded. Her voice was composed. "Officer, I respect your duty, but under both civilian and military jurisdiction, I'm entitled to one call. I'd like to contact my commanding officer to confirm my identity." Though her face was youthful, her voice carried the discipline of someone used to authority. Sunlight caught her bracelet again as she gestured, and even Bryce paused when he noticed the engraved script running around its edge. He couldn't read it, but it clearly meant something. Frustrated, he tried once more to regain control. "She's buying time for her friends to escape," he snapped. "My family's supported this department for decades. Are you really going to let her play you like this?" His group nodded in agreement, lounging beside their luxury car like they owned the block. More people had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Phones were out, recording, but sympathy still leaned heavily against Brooklyn. Thompson, caught between the pressure of the moment and his training, finally handed her his department-issued phone. "You can make the call, but any attempt to flee will result in arrest." Brooklyn took the phone with calm fingers and quickly dialed. The crowd leaned in, expecting to hear the lie unravel. "Captain Hunter, this is Hayes," she said crisply. "Orange Millfield Avenue and 5th. Civilian authority conflict. I request verification." Her words were clipped, exact, like someone well-versed in protocol. The voice that answered from the phone speaker was deep and composed. "Copy that, Hayes. Maintain position. ETA 7 minutes. Do not engage unless threatened." Whispers spread. Some spectators looked around uncertainly. Maybe they had misjudged her. But Bryce laughed, voice high and dismissive. "That was cute," he said, clearly loud enough to perform for the crowd. "Probably just her boyfriend in a fake uniform. Officers, come on. We're really going to let this little act drag out. Then the ground began to hum. Faint at first, then unmistakable. A heavy diesel growl rolled in from the distance, growing louder by the second. Those familiar with combat zones would have recognized it instantly. Military vehicles, moving in formation. The sound silenced everything. Conversations died. Brooklyn stood straight beside her motorcycle, her back erect, her shoulders square. The noise grew into a mechanical roar as Humvees came into view, the very street seeming to tremble under their weight. Thompson's radio crackled with dispatch confusion. No prior notification of a military convoy. Brooklyn raised the metal ID card once more, letting the sun glint off it as she spoke clearly. Honor, courage, commitment. Her voice cut clean through the silence. I served in Syria, Odie. I'm here visiting my grandfather. The crowd shifted uneasily. The card flipped in the light, revealing the unmistakable U.S. military eagle crest. Bryce turned scarlet, words catching in his throat. He tried to object, voice cracking. She's still lying. But no one responded. Bryce's voice cracked slightly under the weight of his own desperation. Anyone can buy military gear online and make up stories about being deployed, he insisted, though the conviction in his words was already waning. Officers, my family's lawyer is going to want a full account of how you handled this obvious case of impersonation and theft. But his attempts to redirect the situation were crumbling just as the deep rumble of engines became impossible to ignore. Even Mrs. Langford, who had been standing proudly at her garden gate moments ago, began to retreat, her confidence withering in the face of what was coming. The first Humvee turned onto Millfield Avenue like a well-oiled machine, hugging the curve with sharp precision. Then came another, and another. Soon, a column of 15 military vehicles rolled into the neighborhood, lining the street from end to end. Their matte green armor and reinforced bodies stood in jarring contrast to the polished sedans and luxury SUVs parked in nearby driveways. The formation moved as one, synchronized, practiced, deliberate. It was not just a show of force. It was the unmistakable cadence of a real combat unit on the move. Gasps spread through the crowd like wildfire. Officer Thompson swallowed hard as the lead Humvee eased to a halt just 20 feet from where Brooklyn stood by her motorcycle. Its engine idled with a low growl, steady and authoritative. Then the top hatch swung open. A tall man climbed out, his posture unmistakably military. His chest bore rows of ribbons and medals, evidence of a career shaped by combat and leadership. With piercing gray eyes and a hardened jaw, he surveyed the scene. Captain Cole Hunter had arrived. He stood a commanding 6'5", his crisp dress uniform practically glowing in the afternoon sun. His presence instantly shifted the atmosphere. Those familiar with military rank and protocol could feel the authority radiating from him before he even spoke. Around him, Marines began to disembark, 200 in total, each one moving with trained efficiency. Their weapons, gear, and movements made it clear they weren't here for ceremony. They were here for her. What had moments ago looked like a neighborhood conflict now resembled a tactical deployment. The street transformed into a makeshift perimeter, Marines locking down the area with practiced movements. Every bystander fell silent, their previous boldness evaporating. Captain Hunter walked with slow, purposeful steps toward the police line, his every motion commanding respect. Officer Thompson instinctively straightened up, a hint of nervousness flickering in his eyes. "Captain, I'm Officer Thompson from the local department," he said, trying to mask his unease. "We received a report of theft. This young woman claims to be one of your soldiers." Hunter's face revealed nothing, but a shadow passed through his eyes when he noticed the handcuffs on Brooklyn's wrists. It was the kind of subtle change that only someone trained in reading expressions might catch, but it carried the weight of a storm building. He took in the full scene. The expensive houses, the confused neighbors, the civilian authorities who had clearly made a grave mistake. His eyes finally settled on Brooklyn, her shoulders straight despite the cuffs, her expression controlled but proud. "I am Captain Cole Hunter, commanding officer of Iron Thunder Company, 3rd Marine Expeditionary Unit," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Specialist Brooklyn Hayes is a combat-decorated Marine under my command. She is currently on approved medical leave to care for a family member. His words landed like a hammer. The mood shifted instantly. Gasps could be heard from the gathered neighbors. Phones that had once been recording with smug curiosity now hung awkwardly at their sides. Brooklyn was no longer just a young woman on a motorcycle. She was a soldier, one of their own, and she wasn't alone. The Marines stood guard all around her, their uniforms crisp, their stances firm. The power and unity they projected dwarfed every ounce of social standing the residents had tried to wield against her. Bryce, suddenly pale and visibly shaken, muttered, "This can't be real. She's just a girl. How could?" But his words vanished into the background hum of military engines. Captain Hunter stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Bryce with the intensity of someone who had led men through war zones and didn't flinch easily. Mrs. Langford, who had been so certain in her judgment earlier, now looked for an escape, her garden no longer the safe vantage point it once was. "Who made the accusation?" Hunter asked sharply. Officer Thompson hesitated, then pointed toward Bryce. "What evidence did you have?" the captain continued, his voice steady but razor-sharp. Bryce opened his mouth, but nothing coherent came out. His social armor, the suit, the connections, the car were meaningless now. He was a man cornered by the truth. Around him, people began to truly grasp what had happened. That this wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a failure of judgment. A decorated Marine had been handcuffed in her own country based on an assumption. Captain Hunter turned back to Brooklyn. With calm, deliberate hands, he removed the cuffs himself. The act wasn't just procedural, it was symbolic. A public correction of a private humiliation. The metallic snap as the cuffs opened sounded like a verdict. Brooklyn instinctively stood at attention, the sunlight catching the silver bracelet that now slid freely on her wrist. The quiet strength she'd maintained throughout the ordeal was no longer silent. It was backed by the weight of her entire unit. Just then, a small voice broke the silence. "She's a real hero," said a little boy from the edge of the crowd, eyes wide with admiration. He wore a camouflage t-shirt and plastic soldiers clipped to his belt. His mother tried to hush him, but other children began to look at Brooklyn the same way, with respect, with awe. Their pure, unfiltered understanding of right and wrong rippled outward. And the adults, who had acted so quickly to judge, now stood in the long shadow of their own actions. For Bryce, the moment marked the end of control. No amount of wealth or entitlement could erase what had just been witnessed. He tried to speak again. "Sir, it was all just a misunderstanding. I thought I was doing the right thing. I didn't know." But Captain Hunter raised a hand, and the apology died in his throat. Everyone understood. The street was no longer a battleground of class or suspicion. It was something else entirely. A reminder that respect must be earned, that judgment without truth carries consequences, and that sometimes the most unassuming people carry the deepest strength. And that behind every uniform, behind every ribbon and medal, is a story worth listening to before casting stones. In a voice that commanded absolute respect, Captain Hunter addressed the stunned crowd. "She has operated in some of the most perilous environments on the planet," he said, every word landing with weight and finality. "Through her skill in explosive ordnance disposal, she has personally saved the lives of 47 American servicemen, often while under direct enemy fire." The statement struck the gathered onlookers like a thunderclap, forcing them to reassess everything they thought they knew. And still, the captain wasn't finished. Not even close. The woman they had so readily condemned had a legacy far deeper than they realized. One symbolized by the unassuming silver bracelet that had drawn so much ignorant scrutiny. As the bracelet caught the late afternoon sun, Captain Hunter stepped forward. His hands, calloused and steady, moved with solemn purpose as he released Brooklyn from the handcuffs. Each metallic click sounded like a verdict being reversed, echoed across the silent neighborhood street. Then, with dignified precision, he stood at attention and delivered a crisp salute. Without hesitation, 200 Marines followed suit, raising their right hands in perfect unison. The sight of an entire military company paying homage to the young woman, dismissed moments ago as nothing more than a suspected thief, hit the crowd with devastating force. Their assumptions, so confidently worn minutes earlier, began to crumble. This bracelet belonged to Colonel Samuel Hayes, Captain Hunter continued, his voice quiet but reverent. A Medal of Honor recipient, a hero of the Gulf War. Brooklyn Hayes is his granddaughter. Each sentence peeled away another layer of judgment and prejudice. Mrs. Langford, who had positioned herself so boldly near her garden gate, gasped and covered her mouth. Her once defiant neighbors edged back into their homes, suddenly unsure of themselves. Brooklyn didn't speak. She didn't need to. As she rubbed her wrists, her silence said more than any speech could. The rows of Marines standing at attention beside her did the talking. She simply nodded once at Captain Hunter, a gesture that carried immeasurable grace. Officer Thompson, who had been among the first to detain her, felt the sting of embarrassment flood his face. He had mistaken honor for deception, duty for criminality. And now, he stood in the presence of someone who had earned the respect of warriors. The spectators, once eager to record her supposed downfall, now fumbled to erase the evidence from their phones. What had begun as a self-righteous attempt to catch a criminal on camera had instead captured a moment of collective failure. Social media posts mocking a thief were hastily replaced with trending tags like #SaluteHayes. The truth moved faster than the lie ever had. Bryce, the man who had instigated the confrontation, now looked out of place in the street he once dominated. His designer suit hung awkwardly on his frame, no longer a symbol of power but a costume from a play whose plot he no longer understood. His Lamborghini, doors still flung open, appeared laughably out of place beside the military vehicles that had arrived in defense of someone far more important than he had ever imagined. Captain Hunter's eyes swept across the crowd, sharp and discerning, a gaze trained by years of separating allies from threats. When he stopped on Bryce, the atmosphere turned cold. Filing false accusations against military personnel is a federal matter, he said. The words, though calm, carried undeniable weight. However, Specialist Hayes has requested that we address this through education, not prosecution. The crowd exhaled, relief mingled with unease. Mercy was being granted, but not without its cost. This was not forgiveness without consequence, but an invitation to learn, to grow. The Marines began to move, returning to their vehicles with the same discipline that had marked their entrance. This wasn't a show of force, it was a lesson in integrity. The sound of engines roaring to life served as a reminder. The power that answered Brooklyn's call was real, principled, and incorruptible. It answered not to status or wealth, but to justice. Mrs. Langford, her usual poise shaken, took slow steps back toward her gate. Her expensive purse clutched tightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but Brooklyn gave her a soft shake of the head. Some things couldn't be undone with words. They needed to be proved over time. The older woman nodded, blinking back tears, already imagining the small bouquet of yellow roses she would leave on Brooklyn's porch the next morning. Officer Thompson, still flushed with embarrassment, stepped forward. Every word would matter now, not just to her, but to the uniformed men and women watching intently. Specialist Hayes, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I want to apologize for the way this was handled. We should have listened first. Brooklyn met his eyes. There was no bitterness in her gaze, only the quiet strength of someone who had nothing left to prove. Her forgiveness, though unspoken, radiated with the same calm authority that had silenced a street full of judgment. Brooklyn's strength, shaped by years of surviving the harshest war zones, was now on full display not through combat, but through the quiet power of her presence. What had begun as a tense standoff, filled with judgment and suspicion, had shifted into something deeper. A mirror held up to a neighborhood that had long lived behind manicured lawns and easy assumptions. The children who had once clung to their parents now looked at Brooklyn with wide-eyed admiration, sensing something noble in her that their elders had failed to see. A young boy in a camouflage shirt raised his hand in a shy salute, a simple act that said everything the crowd had struggled to express. Captain Hunter stepped beside Brooklyn as the last military truck rumbled in place, his voice low and deliberate. "We ship out next month. Your grandfather would have stood proud today." Brooklyn gave a quiet nod, her silence holding the weight of 3 generations of service. The silver bracelet on her wrist glinted in the late sun as she turned to her motorcycle, ready to resume the path that had been unfairly halted. As the convoy departed, the air settled into an uncanny stillness. The ordinary hum of suburban life returned. Lawn sprinklers clicking on, the drone of mowers, doors closing softly. But the people left behind had been changed. In the wake of Brooklyn's composure, the comfortable illusions of superiority and unchallenged authority lay shattered. What had once been seen as normal now looked fragile and exposed. Captain Hunter turned toward Bryce, his voice cutting through the silence like steel. "Specialist Hayes showed you a mercy you didn't earn. Now you will serve. You will learn. And you'll remember this." His tone, forged in combat and command, brooked no argument. Bryce, once so sure of himself in his tailored suit, now stood hollowed out by shame and realization. Brooklyn spoke, her voice steady and unflinching. 200 hours at Walter Reed. You'll mop floors, serve meals, and listen to their stories. Every scar will be a lesson you've ignored your whole life. There was no malice in her tone, just a raw sincerity that peeled away pretense and forced everyone listening to face truths they had long avoided. Her words held the possibility of redemption, even for someone as entitled as Bryce. The weight of her sentence settled visibly on him. Surrounded by Marines and watchful neighbors, Bryce's transformation became painfully evident. His possessions, his luxury car, his designer labels meant nothing here. Not to men and women who had earned respect the hard way. His voice cracked as he whispered, "I accept. I was wrong about everything." Mrs. Langford remained frozen in her garden, her pearl necklace shimmering in the dying light. No apology came. None would have been enough. Instead, she turned slowly toward her house, already forming the quiet gesture of remorse she would make at dawn. Leaving roses on Brooklyn's doorstep. Some regrets needed no words, only action. Officer Thompson said nothing either. He had learned more today from Brooklyn than from all his years on the force. The way she carried herself, the restraint she showed, it humbled him. His reform wouldn't start with a speech. It would start with change, beginning the next day with a department-wide training on bias. But tonight, he would begin by explaining to his own children the dangers of judging people by appearances alone. The military vehicles rolled out in perfect order, their departure just as precise as their arrival. This wasn't about flexing power, it was a lesson, a reckoning. And as the final truck disappeared, the message lingered in its wake. The real authority comes from sacrifice and integrity, not status or wealth. Brooklyn returned to her bike with methodical calm, her focus no less sharp than it had been in the war zones she had once patrolled. Her grandfather was waiting, and she had no more time for those who valued money over honor. The sun caught the inscription on her bracelet: honor, courage, commitment. A quiet declaration of everything she stood for. The impact of the day spread quickly. Videos originally taken to mock her arrest now circulated online as powerful indictments of bias and misjudgment. Hashtags praised her grace and discipline. Neighborhood social media pages once filled with subtle bigotry and casual superiority were suddenly quiet. Old posts vanished, opinions reconsidered. Bryce remained where he stood, his expensive outfit now a reminder of a version of himself that no longer fit. The man who had once tried to wield wealth as a weapon now faced a new beginning shaped by humility and service. His first shift at Walter Reed began at 6 in the morning. For the first time in his life, he looked forward to it. Not for what it would get him, but for what it might teach him. And Millfield Avenue, long wrapped in the safety of wealth and silence, now sat in the quiet of reflection. Not the usual peacefulness of status and comfort, but a new kind of stillness, the uncomfortable but necessary quiet that comes before growth. A new question echoed in every home. What does it really mean to serve? And who among us has the strength to lead with grace, even when no one is watching? Over time, the events that unfolded sparked conversations, shifts in policy, and deeply personal transformations, none of which anyone involved could have predicted. It all began the moment Brooklyn rode her worn motorcycle down Millfield Avenue just as the sun dipped behind the neatly trimmed hedges and gleaming luxury vehicles. That single ride revealed a profound truth to everyone watching. True strength doesn't stem from wealth or influence. It comes from integrity, selflessness, and the courage to do what's right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Instead of seeking vengeance, Brooklyn chose to extend a hand of redemption, an act that revealed a kind of strength no privilege could buy. Her choice taught an entire neighborhood that the greatest force in human relationships isn't power to destroy, but the ability to turn adversaries into allies. A week later, Brooklyn walked through the front doors of Walter Reed Hospital, a bouquet of yellow roses in hand, her silver bracelet catching glimmers of morning sunlight. Though the incident on Millfield Avenue had gained media attention, she had turned down every interview. Her belief was simple: actions speak louder than words. She was headed to her grandfather's room but stopped abruptly as she turned the familiar corner. There, in scrubs and focused on fluffing the pillows for an elderly man in a wheelchair, was Bryce Blackwood. The veteran he was helping was Jim Martinez, an 85-year-old man with sharp eyes and a soldier's resilience. Jim had survived an IED blast in Afghanistan, losing both legs but not his resolve. "So, you're the Marine who gave this rich kid a chance to reclaim his soul," Jim said, his gravelly voice laced with approval. "He's shown up every day since what happened on Millfield. Works harder than most folks half his age. Told me everything. How you could have torn his world apart but chose instead to help him rebuild it." But Jim hadn't always spoken so warmly of Bryce. 3 days earlier, Bryce had shown up at Walter Reed unsure of himself, eager to prove something. He took on the task of mopping the rehab wing's floors with the stiff efficiency of someone more interested in appearances than purpose. "Stop!" Jim had barked from his wheelchair, his voice cut clean through Bryce's false sincerity. "This isn't penance theater. You're not here to ease your guilt. You're here to figure out what you've been blind to your whole life." The words hit Bryce harder than expected, cracking the facade he'd worn like armor. The real change came later, as he paused before a photograph on the wall. A young man who had lost both legs in Syria, smiling despite everything. Bryce stood frozen, staring at that picture for nearly an hour. "That's my grandson," Jim said quietly, rolling up beside him. "Lost his legs at 19. Came back home to people calling him a hero, while stepping off the sidewalk to avoid making eye contact. You think luxury is leather seats and granite kitchens? Luxury is walking on your own 2 legs and choosing to use them for something real." From that moment on, something in Bryce shifted. His work transformed from a task into a mission. His heart, once guarded and performative, began to open. Brooklyn eventually found her grandfather in a therapy session, flanked by physical therapists helping him regain strength lost to recent illness. Colonel Samuel Hayes, even at 78, still carried the quiet authority of a man who had earned the nation's highest military honor. Though age had worn on his body, his spirit remained unshaken. "I brought you something," Brooklyn said softly, offering him a silver bracelet identical to the one she wore. "I thought you should have this, as a reminder of the legacy we both uphold." It was a simple gift, but in that quiet exchange, it became clear that what they carried wasn't just tradition or memory. It was purpose, forged through sacrifice and carried forward with honor. 3 generations worth of duty, sacrifice, and unwavering dedication to ideals beyond personal ambition seemed to rest in the room as Colonel Hayes turned the bracelet over in his weathered hands. Hands that had once disarmed explosives and led soldiers through life-or-death missions. "I heard about what happened on Millfield Avenue," he said to Brooklyn, his voice filled with the quiet pride only a seasoned warrior could carry. "You faced it exactly how a Hayes should, with integrity and wisdom. That's the kind of leadership that wins battles and reshapes hearts." To Brooklyn, those words held more weight than any award or official recognition ever could. Hearing this from the man who had taught her that strength meant character, not brute force, was the kind of affirmation she hadn't realized she needed. As they sat in the stillness of his room, Brooklyn finally voiced something she had kept buried since the confrontation. "There was a moment," she said softly, "when I wanted to fight back. When Bryce was tearing me down in front of everyone, when the crowd looked at me like I was nothing. I wanted to show them what real power looked like. I could have called in backup. I could have made them pay for judging me." Her confession hung in the air, heavy with the tension of a choice narrowly avoided. Colonel Hayes reached out, his fingers brushing the inscription on her bracelet as he took her hand. "The hardest battles," he said gently, "aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with decisions. Anyone can break an enemy. Real strength lies in transforming one into a friend. You didn't just hold your fire, you turned it into a light for someone stumbling in the dark. That's not just leadership in uniform. That's humanity in its highest form." Their conversation was cut short by the hesitant footsteps of Bryce approaching. He looked nothing like the arrogant heir who had once weaponized the law to humiliate someone he saw as beneath him. His posture, his expression, everything about him radiated humility and remorse. "Colonel Hayes," he said, his voice trembling with sincerity, "I'm Bryce Blackwood. I owe your family an apology I'll never be able to fully express, and a debt I'll spend the rest of my life trying to repay." The colonel regarded him with the same discerning gaze he had once reserved for evaluating soldiers, measuring his regret, his sincerity, and the fragile new sense of accountability that clung to him like a second skin. "Brooklyn gave you something precious when she showed you mercy instead of justice," he said, every word steeped in hard-earned wisdom. "The only question now is, what will you do with that gift? Go back to who you were, or become who you're meant to be?" The silence that followed was not awkward, but heavy with significance. Bryce's eyes drifted to the memorial wall behind them, where a brass plate bore the name Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Hayes, Medal of Honor. He stood still for a long moment, understanding dawning across his features. This wasn't just about Brooklyn or himself. It was about finally seeing the lives and sacrifices that had quietly upheld his own privileged existence. He bowed his head in a silent gesture of true respect. Meanwhile, what had begun on Millfield Avenue didn't end there. Its impact reached far beyond that neighborhood, rippling through schools and communities alike. At Jefferson High, a nearby school, student president Sarah Chun organized an assembly called Judged by Our Covers, where students shared deeply personal stories of being misjudged due to appearance, background, or social status. The event caught national attention and inspired dozens of similar gatherings. Online, the hashtag #SimpleHero gained traction. People began posting clips of their own encounters with quietly extraordinary individuals, like a janitor who had once worked on NASA missions, a cashier with military honors, and a construction worker who held a doctorate in literature. Brooklyn's choice to meet injustice with dignity rather than vengeance had become a spark, lighting a broader conversation about assumptions, biases, and the humanity we often overlook. In the months that followed, the transformation continued. Bryce not only fulfilled his court-ordered service hours, he exceeded them. Volunteering became a way of life. He founded the Hayes Foundation, offering scholarships to children of military families. His work with injured veterans exposed him to realities that wealth had once shielded him from, and even skeptics began to acknowledge his sincerity. Brooklyn, meanwhile, returned to active service with Iron Thunder Company, more focused than ever. Her experience with civilian prejudice added new depth to her approach in bridging military and community relations. The silver bracelet on her wrist remained, a symbol of the legacy she bore and a reminder of her grandfather's belief in using one's inner fire to light a path for others. Years down the line, Brooklyn had risen to the rank of general. Bryce had become one of the nation's most respected voices advocating for veterans. Yet, both would always look back to that one afternoon, when compassion proved more powerful than retaliation, and a chance at redemption spoke louder than any confrontation. The greatest victory hadn't been in a public clash or military parade, but in the quiet, unseen transformation of a heart. It was a reminder that lasting change comes not through force, but through the courage to believe in what someone can become, even if they once stood on the wrong side of the fight.